The night shift at the NATO base in Northern Europe had settled into the same slow rhythm it always fell into after midnight. Floodlights poured pale white light across the concrete checkpoint. Wind drifted quietly over the empty motor pool beyond the fence. Two gate guards leaned against the armored barrier booth, watching an access road that barely saw traffic until dawn. That was the moment a single military SUV rolled toward the gate. The driver climbed out before the guards could even ask, already holding up an identification card that didn't match anything you'd expect to see during a midnight shift. The woman looked composed, wearing a standard duty uniform, but her badge threw an error on the scanner. One guard squinted at the screen. The other chuckled and made a crack about someone from an office building stumbling into a restricted intelligence compound. They started questioning her right to be there. What they didn't see was the small coin she placed beside the scanner. It looked like nothing special, but the second the machine read it, the whole base reacted. Concrete barriers slammed into position. Radio traffic switched to encrypted channels. Security doors began locking throughout the compound. The guards stared at the console as warning alerts flooded the screen. Suddenly, the calm woman they had been holding up at the gate might be the only person on the entire base who understood why the security network had just started locking everything down. Staff Sergeant Dana Marsh was not the kind of soldier people noticed when she walked through the NATO compound. She was 29 years old, average height, dark hair pulled tight at the back of her head, wearing the same standard duty uniform as everyone else on the security element. No special patches. No dramatic reputation. Anyone passing her in the hallway would probably assume she was just another routine administrative investigator moving paperwork from one office to another. But Dana's job had very little to do with paperwork. She was a United States Army military police investigator assigned to a joint NATO counterintelligence task force, a small group responsible for tracking security anomalies across the multinational installation. The base itself was a complicated place. American forces worked alongside European units. Communication networks connected multiple countries at once. Every day, hundreds of vehicles, contractors, and service members moved through the gates, and every one of those movements left a trace. Dana spent most of her working hours studying those traces. Her office sat inside a quiet security building close to the communications center. From the outside, it looked like any other administrative space. Inside, several large monitors displayed access logs, vehicle tracking records, and base security feeds. Most people would have found that work painfully dull. Rows of numbers, badge scans, radio timestamps, maintenance reports, patrol route logs. But Dana had a habit that made her unusually effective at the job. She noticed patterns, small ones, the kind most people would scroll past without a second thought. Late at night, she often sat alone reviewing access records from the previous shift and could spot something off within minutes. A maintenance badge that scanned into a building 3 times during a shift when the work order only required 1 entry. A supply truck that logged entering the motor pool, but whose exit time was recorded at a completely different gate. A radio transmission that appeared briefly on a restricted channel, even though no authorized unit had logged into the network. Any one of those details on its own could be harmless, but Dana treated them like puzzle pieces. One evening, she noticed a contractor badge had scanned repeatedly near a communications relay building during hours when the contractor wasn't scheduled to work. Instead of writing it off as a system glitch, she traced the scan locations across 3 different security readers. The pattern showed the badge moving between buildings that shared the same underground fiber network. Another time, vehicle movement records from the fuel depot didn't match the GPS logs from the base motor pool cameras. The gap was only a few minutes, but it suggested someone had tried to move a vehicle without properly logging its route. That habit of digging into small details slowly built her reputation inside the task force. People started saying that if something unusual was happening on base, Dana would probably catch it before anyone else. Her training helped explain why. Before arriving at the NATO base, she had completed the Army Military Police Academy, learning the fundamentals of security enforcement and investigative procedures. After that, she attended an advanced course focused on credential fraud, access control systems, and digital security logs. Later, she was selected for Joint Security Liaison training with several Special Operations Support Units, which exposed her to a different layer of military security systems. Special operations missions often relied on temporary access networks, emergency verification tokens, and authentication methods built to function during crises when normal systems might be down. During one deployment supporting a Ranger security detachment, Dana assisted with an investigation into forged NATO access cards appearing inside a logistics compound. The problem looked minor at first. A few strange badge scans, a contractor whose entry times didn't line up with his shift schedule. But Dana noticed the false credentials were being used near communications infrastructure. When she traced the pattern across multiple buildings, the task force realized someone had been systematically testing access points across the base network. The investigation exposed a credential breach that could have allowed unauthorized personnel into restricted intelligence areas. The Ranger security team credited Dana for identifying the access pattern before it escalated. When the investigation ended, the Ranger unit commander handed her a small challenge coin during a quiet briefing. Most soldiers receive coins as symbolic recognition, but this one was different. Built into the coin was a small encrypted identifier tied to a specialized authentication program used by certain Ranger security elements. When scanned by compatible systems, the coin could activate an emergency verification process designed to confirm the identity of trusted investigators during credential conflicts. Very few people outside the program knew the coin had any operational purpose at all. To most personnel, it just looked like a piece of metal carried by someone who had worked with Rangers. Dana rarely mentioned it. She kept the coin in her pocket the same way some soldiers carry a spare key or a folded note. Just another tool. That quiet approach reflected her personality as well. She stayed calm during tense situations. She rarely raised her voice in disagreements. When others argued over security reports or patrol procedures, she usually stayed quiet until she had enough information to explain what she believed was actually happening. Her goal was never to win arguments. Her goal was to solve problems, and most of the time she did it without drawing any attention to herself. The radio traffic around the checkpoint grew louder with every passing second. Voices from the operations center overlapped with security patrol reports. Someone was asking for confirmation on the lockdown trigger. Another operator was trying to trace the authentication signal that had started the escalation protocol. The two gate guards inside the booth were no longer joking. One kept switching radio channels, while the other stared at the warning messages on the access terminal. But Dana Marsh did not look alarmed. She stood beside the scanner, watching the console screen the way someone studies a puzzle instead of a crisis. "Let me see the log window," she said quietly. One of the guards glanced at her. "This system just triggered a base lockdown." "I know. And you want to check the log?" "Yes." The guard hesitated, then shifted slightly so she could see the monitor through the booth window. The screen showed the authentication chain that had just executed. Most people would have seen nothing but technical data and error codes. Dana studied the timestamps. "What scanner processed the coin?" she asked. The guard pointed to the console. "This one. Gate 7 primary reader." "What time did the escalation trigger exactly?" The guard scrolled the screen. 0042. Dana nodded slightly. "And which authentication server does this reader connect to?" The guard shrugged. I don't know. It goes through the base network. Dana leaned a little closer to the glass. It should route through the primary identity server in the communications building, she said. The guard frowned. Well, whatever it didn't like your coin. Dana didn't respond right away. She kept reading the log entries, following the chain of system messages that appeared after the coin was scanned. Authentication token detected. Verification request transmitted. Routing path error. Secondary protocol engaged. Security escalation initiated. She tapped lightly on the edge of the scanner. Did the system show any network warning before this? The guard shook his head. Not that I noticed. Dana thought for a moment. Behind them, the loudspeaker repeated the security alert again, telling personnel to remain in place until further instructions. She spoke calmly. The scanner isn't the problem. The guard looked at her. Then what is? The routing path. He blinked. What? The authentication server the scanner is using isn't the primary one. How do you know that? She pointed at a small line of text in the system log. See that node address? The guard leaned closer. That's the backup routing channel. The second guard looked up from the radio. What difference does that make? Dana folded her arms lightly as she studied the screen again. The Ranger authentication token is designed to run through a very specific verification sequence, she said. If the system reads it through the wrong server path, the protocol tree changes. The first guard stared at her. You're saying the system is using the wrong server? Yes, and that triggered the lockdown, most likely. The guards exchanged a look. From the operations center, the radio chatter grew even more tense. Command was asking which gate triggered the authentication conflict. The network team reported the identity server was showing duplicated credential alerts. Possible spoofing event. The second guard lowered the radio slowly. Did they just say spoofing? Dana nodded once. That's exactly what the system thinks is happening. The guard looked back at the scanner. But we didn't spoof anything. No, Dana said calmly. The system just thinks someone did. She pointed again at the log entries. When the coin was scanned, the authentication request should have gone directly to the Ranger verification server. Instead, it went through a backup routing node, and the backup node doesn't recognize that authentication token as friendly. The first guard rubbed the back of his neck. So what does it recognize it as? Dana answered without raising her voice. A duplicated credential. The words hung in the air for a moment. The guards slowly understood. That's why the base thinks it's a breach. Yes, and that's why everything is locking down. Behind them, the radio crackled again. Operations to Gate 7. Confirm the object scanned at the reader. The guard looked at Dana. She gave a small nod. The guard keyed the microphone. Gate 7 confirms authentication coin scanned during secondary verification. A pause followed. Then the operations voice returned. Stand by. Network security believes the system detected a credential duplication event. Dana spoke quietly before the guard responded. Tell them the authentication server is probably routing through the backup node. The guard blinked. You sure? Check the log. He glanced at the screen again. The same node address was still visible. He pressed the radio button again. Operations. Gate 7. Scanner appears to be connected to backup routing node. The response took a few seconds. Then another voice came across the channel. Network confirms routing anomaly on authentication server. The guard slowly lowered the radio. He looked back at Dana. You called that pretty fast. She shrugged slightly. I've seen the protocol before. The first guard looked again at the sealed barriers across the base. So what happens now? Dana glanced once more at the screen. If the system keeps running the wrong protocol tree, she said quietly, it will assume a high-level credential breach. And then the base network will isolate itself from external command systems. The guard's eyes went wide. You mean NATO command? Yes, the two guards stared at her now, with completely different expressions than they'd had 20 minutes earlier. The joking tone was gone. In its place was a quiet realization. The calm woman standing outside their booth might understand the base security system better than anyone currently arguing over the radio. Inside the base command center, the atmosphere had shifted from routine night monitoring to controlled confusion. Large display walls filled with system alerts. Operators leaned over their consoles trying to trace the origin of the sudden security escalation. Normally, the base network flagged clear causes for emergency protocols: unauthorized access, intrusion alarms, perimeter breaches. But tonight, the information was fragmented. One console showed a credential spoofing alert tied to the authentication server. Another monitor reported routing instability in the network node responsible for identity verification. A third system log suggested the escalation had been triggered by a legitimate authentication object. None of it lined up cleanly. Where did this start? One analyst asked. Gate 7, another operator replied. Secondary verification event. Was it a badge? Negative. System says it detected a high-level token. Then why did it escalate? The room fell into tense silence, because no one had the full picture yet. Back at Gate 7, the two guards were still staring at the console when Dana spoke again. Can I access the terminal? The first guard looked uncertain. This is a security system. You're not assigned to this checkpoint. No, Dana said calmly. But I know how the authentication protocols work. The second guard glanced at the radio. The command center was still requesting updates. He looked back at Dana. You think you can see something they can't? I think the log will show where the routing error started. The guard hesitated for another moment. Then he stepped aside from the console. All right, he said. Take a look. Dana stepped into the booth, the terminal screen filled with scrolling security logs. To most people, it would have looked like a wall of timestamps and machine messages, but she began reading them line by line. Authentication request received. Token identification. Server handshake attempt. Routing node change. Protocol escalation. She slowed the scroll and focused on the timestamps. The authentication token had been scanned at 0042. The system attempted to route the request to the primary identity server, but 2 milliseconds later, the log showed a different node address. Backup routing channel activated. Dana leaned slightly closer to the screen. There it is, she said quietly. One of the guards leaned over her shoulder. What? The routing shift? He stared at the log. I don't see anything. She pointed to the line. The authentication request should have gone to the primary identity server. Instead, it jumped to the backup routing node. And that matters? Yes. She tapped the console again. The Ranger authentication program only works correctly when the verification request reaches the primary server. What happens if it doesn't? The system assumes the credential might be duplicated. The guards slowly understood. That's why the network thinks someone copied your token. Yes. Behind them, the radio crackled again. Command center to Gate 7. We need confirmation of the authentication object used. The guard grabbed the radio. Gate 7 confirms Ranger authentication coin. The response came quickly. Network security believes the coin triggered the credential compromise protocol. Dana spoke quietly beside him. Tell them the routing path is degraded. The guard hesitated again. You're sure? Look at the log. He glanced back at the screen. The routing change was clearly visible now that she had pointed it out. He pressed the radio button. Command, Gate 7. Authentication request appears to have routed through backup node instead of primary identity server. A pause followed. Then a different voice came across the channel. Older, more controlled. Gate 7, say again. Authentication request routed through backup node. Inside the command center, one of the senior security officers stepped closer to the console. Pull the routing logs, he ordered. An analyst began typing rapidly. The screen filled with network path data. A moment later, the analyst looked up. Sir, Gate 7 might be correct. The officer frowned. Explain. The identity server switched to degraded routing 2 minutes before the authentication request. Why? Looks like a temporary patch pushed earlier tonight caused the primary node to fall back to backup routing. The officer crossed his arms. So the token went through the wrong server. Yes, sir. Back at the gate, Dana continued scanning the logs. Then she spoke quietly. The system hasn't finished the verification sequence. One of the guards looked at her. What do you mean? The lockdown protocol activated before the authentication could complete. So how do we fix it? Dana answered immediately. We don't cancel the lockdown. The guard blinked. You don't? No. Why not? Because the system believes a credential breach is in progress. If you cancel the lockdown manually, the security network may escalate again. The guards exchanged another uncertain glance. So what do? We reroute the authentication request. The guard frowned. Reroute it where? To the correct identity server. At the command center, the senior officer was still studying the routing logs when the radio crackled again. Gate 7 requesting network override. The officer leaned toward the microphone. Explain your request. The guard looked at Dana before speaking. Gate 7 believes authentication token triggered escalation because routing path used backup node. The officer's voice remained calm. And your recommendation? The guard hesitated. Dana spoke quietly beside him. Request temporary override path to primary identity server. The guard repeated her words into the radio. For several seconds, there was no response. Inside the command center, the senior officer studied the network diagram on the screen. If the explanation was correct, the token verification had simply been processed through the wrong server, but overriding authentication routing during a lockdown was not something done casually. He turned to the network engineer. Can we temporarily restore the primary identity path? The engineer nodded slowly. Yes, sir. If we force the authentication server back to the primary domain, and what happens if the token is actually compromised? The lockdown will remain active. The officer thought for another moment. Then he picked up the radio. Gate 7, go ahead. Who is advising you on this routing issue? The guard glanced at Dana, Staff Sergeant Dana Marsh, military police investigator. The officer paused. Then he said calmly, put her on the radio. Dana stepped forward. This is Marsh, Staff Sergeant, the officer said. You believe the authentication token triggered escalation due to a routing error? Yes, sir. And your recommendation is to reroute verification through the primary identity server? Yes, sir. Why? Because the backup node interprets the Ranger token as a duplicated credential. The primary server recognizes it as a verified investigative authentication object. Another short pause followed. The officer asked one final question. If we reroute and you're wrong, the lockdown stays active, Dana said calmly. But if we don't reroute, the system will escalate to full network isolation. Inside the command center, the officer nodded slowly. That's correct, the network engineer said quietly beside him. The officer lifted the microphone again. Communications operations. Authorize temporary override. Restore authentication routing to primary identity server. Across the base, the network engineers began adjusting the routing path. Back at Gate 7, the scanner terminal flickered. A new line appeared on the screen. Authentication request reprocessing. The guards watched the monitor without speaking. The system ran through the verification sequence again. Token identification, server handshake, primary authentication confirmed. The screen changed color. Credential verified. Security escalation error detected. Inside the base, the lockdown sequence began reversing. Concrete vehicle barriers slowly lowered. Internal security doors unlocked. Encrypted radio channels shifted back to standard communication frequencies. In the command center, several alerts disappeared from the display wall. The senior officer looked at the screen. Isolation protocol canceled. Back at the gate, the two guards stared at the console. The same system that had locked down the entire base minutes earlier was now returning to normal operation. One of the guards exhaled slowly. "Well," he said quietly, "I guess that worked." The base had already begun returning to its normal night rhythm. Barriers had lowered. Patrol vehicles resumed their routes. Radio chatter had settled back into routine check-ins. But the checkpoint still felt tense. The two guards stood a little straighter when the vehicle stopped beside the booth. A tall officer stepped out wearing a NATO Security Command patch on his sleeve. His posture carried the quiet authority of someone used to investigating problems rather than reacting to them. He nodded briefly to the guards before stepping inside the booth. "Which terminal processed the authentication request?" he asked. One of the guards pointed at the console. "That one, sir." The officer leaned over the screen and began reviewing the system log chain. He didn't rush. His eyes moved slowly down the timestamps, following the sequence from the first ID scan to the escalation protocol, and finally to the routing correction that restored the network. After a moment, he glanced toward Dana. "Your staff, Sergeant Marsh." "Yes, sir." He returned his attention to the screen. The logs told a very specific story. The authentication server had shifted into degraded routing mode shortly before the coin was scanned. The verification request had then passed through a backup node that interpreted the token as a duplicated credential. The system responded exactly as it was designed to do during a potential compromise event. It initiated a lockdown. The officer straightened and folded his arms. "This wasn't a gate error," he said calmly. The two guards visibly relaxed, and it wasn't an intrusion attempt either. He tapped one of the log lines with his finger. What happened here was a rare overlap of three independent systems. He counted them off quietly. Network routing degradation, credential verification overlap, emergency authentication token activation. Each one by itself would have caused no major disruption. Together, they had triggered a security protocol powerful enough to isolate the entire base network. The officer looked back at Dana again. Most people in this situation would have focused on the badge dispute. Dana didn't respond. The officer continued, "But you didn't." He nodded toward the screen. "You looked at the behavior of the system instead of the behavior of the user." He paused for a moment before adding one more sentence. "If the routing path hadn't been corrected, the escalation protocol would have continued." The guards exchanged a quiet glance. The officer finished the thought calmly, and NATO command systems would have isolated this base from external intelligence networks. He turned fully toward Dana. "Your analysis prevented that." The NATO security officer finished reviewing the logs and stepped back from the console. For a moment, the checkpoint booth was quiet, except for the soft hum of the terminal and the distant sound of vehicles moving again through the base. The officer nodded once toward Dana. "Good work, Staff Sergeant," he said calmly. Then he gave a brief instruction to the guards to submit their incident report to the operations center and returned to his vehicle. Within a few seconds, the car rolled away toward the command building, leaving the checkpoint once again under the floodlights and the quiet rhythm of the night shift. The two guards stood inside the booth without speaking for a moment. Only half an hour earlier, they had been joking about the unfamiliar badge and questioning why someone like her was trying to enter the intelligence compound after midnight. Now the console screen in front of them showed the entire chain of events that had followed that moment. The Ranger authentication token, the routing conflict, the escalation protocol, the lockdown. One of the guards slowly leaned back against the wall and looked at Dana. "So that coin," he said carefully. "That wasn't just a challenge coin." Dana shook her head slightly. "No." The second guard glanced at the small piece of metal resting in her hand. "What exactly is it tied to?" "It's part of an investigative authentication system," she replied, "used during certain security investigations." The guard studied the coin again, this time with a completely different expression than earlier. "That means when the system saw it, it assumed something serious was happening." "Yes." He exhaled slowly. No wonder the whole base reacted. For a moment, none of them spoke. The tension that had filled the booth earlier had faded, replaced by a quieter awareness of how close the situation had come to becoming much worse. Finally, the first guard cleared his throat. "Staff Sergeant, about earlier." Dana looked at him. "We thought you were just another officer who ended up at the wrong gate." The second guard nodded. "We didn't realize you were working with the investigative task force." Dana slipped the coin back into her pocket. "You didn't need to." The guards exchanged a glance. "You're not upset?" one of them asked. "No, but we questioned your credentials." "That's your job," she said simply. The first guard gave a small nod. "Still," he said, "we probably could have handled that conversation a little better." Dana didn't argue. She only said quietly, "You followed procedure." And that was true. The scanner had returned an incomplete verification. They had challenged the access request. They had asked for clarification. Everything they had done was exactly what Checkpoint Security was designed to do. The difference now was that the guards understood who they had been dealing with. They were no longer looking at a visitor whose badge confused the system. They were looking at someone trusted to investigate the very kinds of security failures that had just unfolded. The second guard glanced once more toward the access road. Then he looked back at Dana. "I guess the system trusted you before we did." Dana gave a faint smile, barely noticeable. Systems usually follow their programming. The guard nodded slowly. Then he straightened his posture slightly, almost unconsciously. "Staff Sergeant Marsh," he said. This time the title sounded different. Not suspicious, not joking, professional. Dana returned the nod. The moment didn't need anything more than that. Outside, the checkpoint lights still washed the road in white beams. Patrol vehicles moved quietly through the gate again. The base had returned to its normal operations, but inside the small booth, the earlier skepticism had disappeared completely. The Ranger coin was no longer just an unfamiliar object on a scanner. Now it represented something else. Trust placed in someone whose job was to notice the things others missed. Inside the NATO command center, the atmosphere slowly returned to the steady rhythm of a normal night shift. The large wall displays that had been filled with warning alerts were now showing routine network activity again. A few engineers remained at their consoles reviewing the system logs that had triggered the unexpected lockdown. One network specialist pulled up the routing history from earlier in the evening. The authentication server had changed behavior approximately 20 minutes before the incident at Gate 7. A small update had been applied as part of a routine software patch designed to improve identity server synchronization across the base network. The patch itself had not failed, but it had temporarily forced the authentication server to switch into degraded routing mode, while the update synchronized across several nodes. Normally, the system would correct itself within minutes. Unfortunately, the Ranger authentication coin had been scanned during that exact window. The backup routing channel did not recognize the special verification protocol attached to the token. Instead of confirming the identity request, the system interpreted the signal as a duplicated credential event. From the software's perspective, the response had been completely logical. It initiated a protective escalation. Several engineers nodded as they reviewed the chain of events. None of the individual system components had technically malfunctioned. The problem had come from the overlap of several small conditions happening at the same time. A routine patch, a backup routing channel, an uncommon authentication token. Together, they had created the appearance of a major security threat. Later that morning, Staff Sergeant Dana Marsh submitted a short report summarizing the sequence at Gate 7. Her explanation focused on the timing of the routing shift and the protocol difference between the primary and backup authentication servers. The report was added to the base's after-action analysis file. Within a few hours, the network engineers had already updated their patch procedures so that authentication nodes would temporarily suspend special token verification during future updates. The incident quietly became a training reference for security personnel across the installation. A reminder that complex systems rarely fail because of one large mistake. More often, problems emerge when several small technical issues align at exactly the same moment. And that night, one investigator had simply recognized the pattern first. The sky above the NATO base slowly shifted from deep blue to the pale gray of early morning. The long night had finally started to loosen its grip on the compound. At Gate 7, vehicles began moving through the checkpoint again. Engines rolled forward one at a time. Badge scanners beeped with normal approvals. The radio traffic across the security channel settled into the familiar rhythm of routine patrol updates. Staff Sergeant Dana Marsh walked back through the same checkpoint where the confusion had started hours earlier. The two guards noticed her immediately. This time they didn't question her badge. They simply nodded with quiet respect. Dana paused for a moment beside the scanner, flipping the Ranger coin once in her hand before sliding it back into her pocket. Then she continued toward the intelligence building as the first light of sunrise spread across the base. The night shift ended without ceremony, but everyone who had witnessed the lockdown knew exactly why the base stayed operational. If you respect quiet professionalism and real military stories like this one, subscribe to Old Bill's Tales for more military and veteran stories.